brought this up, I think the last meeting or the meeting before that, how we need to put our heads together on the calendar to determine if there's enough time for PLCs, in order for PLCs to be effective across the district. So we've asked Dr. Carlin to get some information together for us so that we can come together and give a cohesive directive on behalf of the board to the calendar committee so that they can do their job. So with that said, Dr. Carlin, the floor is yours.
Thanks. In your packet, there are 12 or 13 pages, 11 pages, I guess, of information. There's a number at the top of each of those, so I'll be referencing that stuff a little bit. And I know you're probably familiar with this, but just a brief review of the first 3 pages are our negotiated agreement and kind of how the calendar process works in our district. So, and before I get into this, some of this is probably not going to be near as exciting as the other presentations that we've heard about. But I have a new strategy now. If I see people not paying attention, we may get up and dance. So,
we're doing aerobics, yeah.
Some of Mr. Biju's brain dances. So basically, in our district, our calendar comes about as a recommendation to the board through our calendar committee, which is charged with, really the process is pretty well defined. They have to create 2 calendars that comply with all the requirements of the negotiated agreement, that comply with the applicable state law that's in place, that comes from, and state regulations that deals with the number of hours or days that we attend school. And the way and then once those 2 traditional calendar options are defined, then those go out to the vote of the entire staff of the district, and whichever calendar receives the most votes, that calendar then is recommended to the board as a traditional, as the calendar. This has been the process for probably close to 20 years in the district. About 6 or 7 years ago, we changed that slightly, because we had a year about 8 or 9 years ago where we wanted to add 3 days to our contract with teachers. And 2 of those days were going to be student contact days, and 1 was going to be an in-service day. And this was back in the times when the finances were good and there was actually some money coming to the state. And we wanted our calendar to be closer to the state median in terms of the amount of student contact time that we have in the district. And so we actually wanted to pay for those days. Well, we ran into a problem, because in our agreement said the calendar committee has to follow this process, and our agreement said we could only have 171 days of student contact, or 172 and a half days of student contact time. So when the calendar committee met to do their work, they had to follow the negotiated agreement. They couldn't create a calendar that had 174 and a half days. And it was a kind of a chicken and the egg kind of thing. So it took us probably 2 years to get through a process that we should have been able to get through in 1 year. And then a year or 2 after that, we started thinking there may be other things in terms of changes to our calendar, and we really don't want to be bound exclusively by these requirements. So through negotiations, the teachers saw this the same way that the administration and the board did, and we were able to add some language to our agreement that kind of amends that process. So we still go through that first part of the process, but then the calendar committee has the option to develop an alternative calendar that does not have to meet the requirements of the negotiated agreement. And if the committee so chooses, and they identify a calendar they wish to propose, then a second vote is held with staff that takes that traditional calendar winning calendar against the alternative calendar, and if the alternative calendar receives enough votes, then that calendar would be the calendar that would be recommended to the board. Otherwise, it's the traditional calendar that was selected in the first vote. So there is a mechanism whereby we can be a little creative in terms of what calendar option is recommended to the board. Now, as the board, you have the legal authority to set the calendar for the district. And the negotiated agreement doesn't change that. I think the board's history has been to accept the recommendation. I think our board has a history of valuing committee work. There's only been one time in the last probably 15 years that I'm aware where the board didn't take the recommendation of the calendar committee as presented. There was an issue in there that the board didn't feel like they could support. The board didn't go in and start moving days around. The board said to the committee, we can't support this. You guys go back, think about it again. The calendar committee went back, came back with another calendar, and that ultimately then was approved by the board. But the board does have the legal authority to set the calendar. With that said, the board still has to set a calendar that complies with the negotiated agreement. For example, our negotiated agreement says that we have a maximum of 184.5 contract days for teachers. The board could not come back and set a calendar and say, we think it'd be a good idea if teachers worked 200 days, because that would violate the agreement and we would be out of compliance with the agreement. However, if there's something different we wanted to do with our calendar, as long as the parameters of the agreement were met, legally the board has that authority. So with that said, I'm going to kind of go over briefly the last about 4 years, 4 or 5 years of what we've done in terms of alternative calendars. I believe the first alternative calendar that...
Sorry, Dr. Cron, if I can interrupt you.
Sure.
I'm looking at your page 3.
Okay.
So it's page 3 on the top. And it talks about how the calendar could be proposed under the following guidelines. And I may be reading too much into what is there, but as I was reading it at the calendar committee meeting the other day and rereading it today, it seems to me that if the calendar committee does not recommend an alternative calendar, even if it complies with everything within the negotiated agreement, the board can't adopt it based off of this. That's how I'm reading it, because we have if an alternative calendar is developed, if the alternative calendar receives the majority of votes, and then if adopted. So it seems to me the wording that we have in here is that we have to go with the traditional calendar if it's not, if that's what's approved by the teachers. That's how I'm reading it.
Yeah. I believe the intent of the language was a mechanism whereby the calendar committee could propose an alternative calendar. But you as the board have the legal authority to set any calendar you so deem fit, as long as it complies with the requirements in the agreement. And that's been, I think that's been our understanding in negotiations. And I'm not advocating that. I'm simply trying to lay out the parameters as I understand them. But Laura, I'll seek some advice from KASB.
Right. I know in the negotiations when we talked about this, that's what the intent has been, but I don't know if we accomplished that and what the language is. So, even if, an alternative calendar could still meet all of the requirements. So, might still be something that we can do, but it just doesn't seem like, unless if it's proposed by the committee and approved by the teachers and actually all the staff, because all the staff votes on it, that we would be able to approve it. That's how I'm looking at this right now.
Okay.
Well, let's move forward for the purpose of the discussion with the understanding of what you've described.
Okay.
And just for information, the calendar committee board members are Tim Cruz and Laura Orrs. So, okay, go ahead.
Okay, so jumping to page 11, this is our current calendar. This is what we would consider to be, and again, this is just in there for your reference, This is what's considered to be a traditional calendar. Some things that you'll notice on the calendar, we start August 4th, and I'm just again going to run through this because we have a little system that we use, and if you're not familiar with it, maybe I can save you some decoding time. The 4th, 5th, and 6th of August, the pentagon shape there is new teacher only days. The 7th and 8th and 11th are all teacher in-service days. The 12th is an all teacher work day, and the 13th of August is our first day of school, a half day. September 1st is indicated there is a holiday. October 24th is a half work day for all staff and half new teacher in-service day. The circles on the 30th and 31st indicate parent-teacher conferences. There's 3 days of non-duty time around Thanksgiving in November. From the 22nd to the 31st of December is winter break in December. The first day back on January 5th is a work day. The 30th of January is an in-service day. The 20th is another half and half day. And the 26th and 27th is parent-teacher conferences. Spring break's a week in March. And then there's 2 non-duty days around Easter in April. One of those is strictly non-duty. The other day on the 6th, I believe, is an in-service day. And that's what we call a release day, which basically means if teachers do 7 hours of in-service outside their contract time, they don't have to come to work that day. They've made up that time in advance. If they don't do that time, then they're required to be at work and attend the in-service that's offered in the district that day. The 4th is another in-service day, and the 22nd is the last day of May, is the last day of work contract for the teachers. You'll notice there's some brackets. The last one, the right bracket, is around May 8th, starts around March 2nd. That's what we're estimating to be the testing window. You'll see there's 6 in-service days sprinkled throughout the year. There's 4 work days. You'll also see we break down and we look at the number of days in each term, and as the committee's looking at those things. So this is a fairly standard, traditional type calendar. There's always lots of questions. Why don't we take more time off around Easter? Well, because we want to be done before Memorial Day. Why do we start so early in August? Well, because we want to take 2 weeks off at Christmas. We want to finish the first semester before Christmas break, and we want to be done before Memorial Day. So there's a lot of things that people will see in these that they'll think, hey, if we did this, or why don't we do that? The committee tries to look at all of those things and prioritize what they hear as important. So the first task that the committee is working on right now is coming up with 2 viable traditional calendars. You'll notice on page 9 and 10, this is the first time, it was in the 2011-12 year, this was the first alternative calendar that was proposed. And I'm going to summarize real briefly. The idea here was that on Wednesdays, we would release students 1 hour early, and that time would be available 60 minutes early. That time would be available for PLC meetings. The way we came up with the time that's used there is I believe we took 4 of the 6 in-service days and created 28 hours of time that could be used differently, and that's created the 28, there's 28 Wednesdays if you'll notice on that calendar. So we waited until September and we took those days off except for in the month of March. And the reason we didn't do March is we didn't have enough time to make that one work. This calendar went out to a vote, and I believe it got about 25% positives when it went out to the vote against the traditional calendar. Pages 6, 7, and 8 were the 13-14 year. You'll notice there's a year missing there, the 12-13 year. We didn't propose an alternative calendar that year because that was the year we moved into the new high school. And and there were a lot of changes that were already underway, so the committee elected not to look at an alternative that year, with the belief that, there was enough change going on in the district. The 13-14 calendar, this was, I believe, a 2-hour, we were trying to create 2 hours of work time. The committee felt like 60 minutes may not be enough by the time teachers got together, especially if teachers were meeting with teachers from other buildings. So they went for a 2-hour time, and we did that by repurposing some of the teachers have to be at school 30 minutes before school starts and 20 minutes after. So we did that by utilizing that time a little bit differently, and using some of that time as well as using 4 of those in-service days. The calendar that we came up there, again, was on Wednesdays. We started in October, and by starting in October, we were able to go the remainder of the year, and we were creating that early release time. Students would have been released an hour early. Teachers would have then went an hour late on Wednesdays. And that time, again, would have been used for collaboration, PLCs, professional development.
What was the discussion as far as extracurricular activities, be it band, be it coaches, be it whatever, and games and all that?
Wednesdays were picked because it wouldn't conflict with games. I think that was part of the thinking that went on there. It would have created a situation where practices would have had to have started a little late, and I think we looked at still probably having I guess an end of activity time by 6:30 or 6:45 at night to respect community activities that are going on. But that certainly was part of the conversation. That was something the committee looked at and made a conscious decision to choose Wednesdays. And the vote went out that year, and it was about a third, about 33% that were in favor. So we went from a quarter to a third, but still didn't get enough support to recommend that calendar to the board. Last year, that's on page 4 and 5. Another version of that calendar was developed. Nice little idea came up. Instead of using that extra 10 minutes to create the meeting time that came out of the 30 minutes before staff started, the idea was, what if we only have staff come 20 minutes early and we add 10 minutes to the instructional day? So instead of going to school for 6 hours and 40 minutes, students would have a 6-hour and 50-minute day. By doing that, we were able to create, and then also using 4 of those release days, we were able to create, I believe it was 28 days again, may have been more. We were able to start basically in September and go through the remainder of the school year. And this time they decided Fridays, Tom, so I mean, you can pick any day of the week. It's workable. Some of the thinking with Friday was we're going to have kids who are going to be gone on activities, so releasing early that day is not going to, kids aren't going to miss as much school. Granted, we're going to have some coaches who are out of town who may not be able to participate. But the conversation went around Wednesdays, went around Fridays, went around other days of the week. But the committee felt like Friday was a viable alternative and was worth a try. The vote went out last year, we got 38% who voted in favor of it. So again, we saw an increase in the amount of support. We have some buildings that are very supportive of this, some staff that are very supportive of it. Last year we looked at year-round options, we looked at early release options, and this was the calendar that I think the committee felt had the best benefit for students along with the best opportunity to be successful. And the committee's met once this year. Probably one of the things they've done that's noteworthy is they've set a goal of coming up with the best calendar that creates a positive environment for student learning. We're sending out a survey that'll go out tomorrow, and hopefully by the end of the first semester, we'll have 2 traditional calendar options that are out and voted upon, and the committee will have started embarking on looking at alternative or collaboration calendar options with the goal of having a final recommendation for the board by the 1st of February. So that's a quick snapshot of the last 3 years, 4 years. Joanne Mangan's here. She's GCA president and has been on that committee for 2 years. And but I think aware of the work that they've done and has been involved with negotiations and lots of stuff. And then Rand Allen's here, and one of the things that the KH Conclave kind of took upon themselves last year was to devote some time to studying the concept of a collaboration calendar or an alternative calendar, and they were very influential with the committee in providing information that helped the committee, and so I think they still have an interest in that, the teachers at Kenneth Henderson. So I think questions, discussion, thoughts. Tim and Laura, I'm sure will appreciate any guidance that you as a board may want to provide that they can take back to the committee. Because the last thing we want to do is come up with a wonderful calendar that comes to the board and the board says, well, yeah, that's great, but that's not something we can get behind. So if you have direction that you want to give us, we'd appreciate it.
Something I've heard, and it started with the model school conference and the discussion that followed, was that PLC time is a very pivotal part of moving in the direction that, from what I understand, we want to head towards becoming more of a model district. I think that those who attended the model school conference learned that collaboration time is important to moving forward with honing in teacher skills to help with student achievement. I am also aware, and I'm hearing from faculty meetings, that some buildings have figured out, and they're rolling with it. And that there's some buildings that haven't got it figured out. And I think that if we had a district-wide approach to how we expect PLCs and collaboration time to be implemented, I think it would help at the building level and ultimately with student achievement. It would help our district move towards the direction that we want to go in. So that's kind of why I wanted to have this discussion, so that we could advise Laura and Tim and the committee how to move in the direction that we could support as a board. So, yeah, Mark.
Madam Chair, I'm just kind of curious here. First of all, I echo what you're saying. It's exciting to see in some buildings how they've implemented PLCs and to hear some of that feedback. And that's probably a cultural thing that's just it's bound to take on excitement and vigor in the other buildings by what I've heard from the initial reports. And that's why these kind of calendars like this just are pretty interesting and seem to address some of the points you're making. So I'm kind of excited about looking at it, the fact that the calendar committee and that we're sort of committed over the last few years to continue to look at these calendars, and that the acceptance and the thinking process is building. Based on these recent reports on PLCs, I don't know why it would be unreasonable to expect even a better acceptance of the concept. So I hope we keep looking at it. I'm noting the hour on this particular meeting, and just my own desire to try to absorb some of this. I'm not sure whether we're looking for a specific action of the board this evening, or just simply sort of some concurrence and feedback.
A concurrence and feedback is what my hope is for this evening.
If I could, I think we have a district policy, or at least guidance, with regard to the PLCs. I mean, I believe very much that Dr. Dennis and Ms. Roderick and Dr. Ava have set forth what we're hoping to achieve. Our issue is getting there. But based off of Mark's comment also, right now the calendar committee's focusing on traditional. So even if it's just a brief 2-minute, yeah, we're good with the way things were, I think it would be helpful if there were any issues with the traditional calendar, that we can take those back for the meeting on the 20th, since that's what we're going to be focusing on, and then go into the alternative calendar. That way, Tim and I know and can help guide the discussion on the traditional calendar, because another survey will be going out probably January. Is that the timeline?
End of December or January.
Okay, to get feedback on teachers for an alternative calendar. And, you know, I think getting information first on traditional, if there's any concerns there, and then going into discussions about the alternative, because there's so much more